Great, perfect. Didn't want to start without it actually working. That would be a problem. Anyway, thank you all for coming here tonight. You know, above all, I hope that we adequately communicate to everyone out there how grateful we are that you support Crocker Farm, that you support Stoneware, that you're passionate about it, all those sorts of things. We never take for granted any bidder. We never take for granted any consigner. So honestly, we've been doing this for 20 years, and it's in huge part because of all of you. So again, thank you very much. Again, thank you for tuning in tonight. You know, it is hard to believe that we have been having auctions for 20 years now. It sort of seems like a long time ago, but it really doesn't seem that long ago that we were driving a big truck full of stoneware out to the Washington County Agricultural Education Center in Boonesboro, Maryland, which is about an hour and a half from where our gallery is now. That was where we had our very first auction, and then 3 more auctions. You know, that sale really was a resounding success, and it was a resounding success because of the excellent consignments we were able to get, and then hopefully we had something to do with that as well. But you know, the success of that auction really kind of verified for us that our decision to make a foray into the auction world was a correct one. We had kind of had an idea, for those of you who don't know the history of Crocker Farm, you know, my brothers Mark and Luke and I grew up around American Stoneware because Crocker Farm grew out of a business that my mom and dad started in 1983. And the 5 of us started this business together in the early 2000s as really an outgrowth of that business. My brothers and I grew up around American Stoneware, carrying these objects to various antique shows up and down the East Coast. And really, in some ways, without us even realizing it, we obtained a really solid knowledge of this material. And so we were buying and selling it basically. And we'd had a website that we launched in 2001. That was really the first website dedicated to buying and selling American Stoneware. But you know, we felt as around the year 2003, 2004, it might be time to start having an auction. And part of the reason for that, actually there were many reasons, but one, we really felt that we could bring our knowledge to the table to help the consignor. Instead of just buying and selling things, we could actually use the knowledge that we had to assist the consignor. That just seemed more gratifying than buying and selling things. On top of that, we really wanted to start to attach research to these objects in a way that we weren't seeing at the time. We really wanted to augment the stories of American ceramics in a way we weren't really seeing them be told. There were exceptions to that, but in general, stoneware was often sold kind of at face value. People, they collected certain makers' marks and they were interested in the history and things like that, but there wasn't really a deep drilling down into the history of these objects in a way we wanted to see. We also wanted to bring stoneware more to like just the general art community. Stoneware was kind of an insular thing at that time, and we felt like this is quintessential American art. It should be appreciated on that level. I think that that has happened over the last 20 years and then some, which has been incredibly gratifying to see. You know, I like to think that we had some hand in that. It's just an exciting thing for us to see these objects more and more acquired by major American institutions. And I would just say lastly, we really wanted to present these objects that we care about in a beautiful way. We were used to seeing American Stoneware presented in auction catalogs that were often just black and white photographs, quick descriptions. You know, also, sometimes inaccurate condition reports. Like, we really wanted to hammer all those things home and do this in the right way. So anyway, again, though, thank you to all of you, and thank you for tuning in tonight. I'm going to start this talk with the picture of our first auction catalog. Now, You can see this was a really exceptional sale, and we were really privileged to be able to bring this material to market for the first time. A couple pieces that really stick out in my mind are these two. When I think of that first sale, these kind of jump to mind immediately. That picture on the left was made by Henry Remy in Baltimore, and we were able to confidently attribute that to him, something that really wouldn't have happened in the past, but I'm going to get to why we were able to do that in a minute. But that brought $35,200, which was a really significant hammer price for American stoneware at the time. On the right, there was that fantastic Timberville picture, which to my mind is still the best piece of Timberville stoneware I've ever seen, and we were able to kind of take that out of the more regional Rockingham County market, properly attribute it, because it was not attributed to anyone when we got a hold of it, and it brought $14,300. But really, the big showstopper of this auction was this fantastic cooler. Now, the consignor had purchased this cooler in Chester County, Pennsylvania, and it really came out of nowhere. It's related to another cooler that had surfaced in the Hagerstown, Maryland area sometime in, I guess, the 1990s. And that one eventually sold at the famous Mockmer sale. Not too long, I don't think, before we had this auction on July 17th, 2004. But the thing I really want to drive home here is prior to that auction, no one really knew who made the objects that were stamped with the maker's mark that appears on this object, which is H. Myers. At the time, it was kind of a mystery that begged to be solved, and a lot of people wanted to see it solved. I remember hearing at the time pretty frequently, I would say the prevalent idea was that these objects were made in Philadelphia, but my brother Luke came to believe that maybe they were made in Baltimore. Now, Luke was someone obviously who grew up around Baltimore stoneware. I can't emphasize enough how much of this material we encountered on a regular basis growing up. And I will say that a lot of these pieces, in particular, if you look at the tulip decorated piece on the right there, these were often attributed as nebulously Pennsylvania objects. Well, Luke started to say, wait a second, there's a reason why these objects are showing up all around the Baltimore area on a regular basis. He was also at this time becoming exceedingly interested in a potter by the name of David Parr. Now, David Parr was one of, by far, the most important Baltimore stoneware potters, and because of that, because Baltimore, despite what was thought at the time, was one of the most important style centers in all of American stoneware. David Parr is actually one of the most important American stoneware potters. So you will see everywhere from, heck, Facebook to the Antiques Roadshow, people batting around today the name David Parr and attributing work to his shop. Those attributions entirely come from the work that Luke did basically in my parents' house, piecing together the history of these objects using capacity marks, a couple of signed objects, things like that. This was the kind of work Luke was doing really around the year 2000 when he was at Johns Hopkins University and he was writing a thesis on Baltimore stoneware that ended up being an award-winning thesis. And a lot of the Baltimore attributions you see now are directly from Luke. Now, this object, he came to think that perhaps these objects that just say H. Myers, there's no town stamped into them, were made in Baltimore by a potter named Henry Remy. I'm not going to get into the full history of Henry Remy, but for those of you who aren't familiar with him, he really did transform the American stoneware craft. And these incised objects pointed to something like a potter who had perhaps come from Manhattan, where this style of decoration was commonly seen, and that would fit with Henry Remy, who had come from Manhattan in 1812. They just sort of looked like the few signed objects as well that say H. Remy Baltimore on them, but we couldn't figure out where H. Myers came in that story. Now, one thing Luke would do around this time is he would pretty exhaustively look through Baltimore stoneware newspapers. And today it is very easy to go online and do searches and all these sorts of things. You couldn't do that at the time. And he would go down to this library that I'm showing you. This is from the 1940s, but the last time I was there, it didn't look much different than this. This is the library at the Maryland Historical Society, now called the Maryland Center for History and Culture, down in Baltimore City. And I would sometimes go with him. And even though it was exhausting, it was pretty fun to just crank through these papers. This isn't the case really in most other American cities, but for Baltimore, it was pretty rewarding to comb through these papers because you'd see advertisements frequently for stoneware potters. And one day we came across this ad. Now, I think this is the actual picture we took over 20 years ago of the microfilm reader that day that advertised stoneware manufactured by a merchant named Henry Myers. And so this certainly seemed like the H. Myers that we were so actively seeking at the time, but even better, almost a dream come true, it spelled out very clearly in this advertisement that my stoneware establishment is conducted by Henry Remy and Son Late of New York. And in the manufacturing of the above article, they are not inferior to any in the United States. That solved the problem we had been working on for so long. And we incorporated that into our first auction catalog. That was an exciting thing to do. That very ad ran in that catalog. And this object brought $72,600, which was the world auction record for Baltimore stoneware at the time. This object, when I go through and think about our history of Crocker Farm, this one just sticks out to me because one, it highlights something that's really true about our business, which is a lot of times the objects we handle come out of nowhere. This was literally found in a closet in California. It is a really small sized jug. It's not a miniature, but you can you can hold it with one hand. And you can see here that on the left, we have a heart at the top, and that heart is inscribed BH. We have an inscription on the right there that says Benjamin Harrington, June the 1st, 1823. And then we have ATAT 22. I didn't know what that meant at the time. We came to find out that meant aged 22. And then you have that urn there. It's a somewhat melancholy looking urn. We really, when you see an object like this for the first time, you immediately just sort of start trying to formulate in your mind what all this could mean. And thankfully, we were able to find, through research, an obituary, basically, for this poor gentleman, Benjamin Harrington. It says, drowned. At an early hour on Sunday morning last, Mr. Benjamin Harrington, aged 22 years, was drowned by upsetting of a boat in our harbor. And this is Norwich, Connecticut we're talking about. The deceased was a potter by trade, a steady, industrious young man and a native of Schenectady, New York. His body had not been found when our paper went to press. So this is a very sad story, but you can see like the camaraderie of the stoneware shop in this object that was probably made by his fellow potters to commemorate him and his sad fate. You know, at the time, the world auction record for Baltimore stoneware, and this is in 2011, by the way, I forgot to say that. The record for Baltimore stoneware at the time was $148,500. It had sold at Sotheby's in the early 90s, I believe 1991. So it took quite a while for that record to finally be broken. This one didn't do it, but it got close. This is one of the first objects we ever sold for in the six figures, and it brought $138,000. I would say, speaking of research, that there's really nothing we've given the decorative arts community more substantial than the research that we've done on Thomas Kammerer. So a lot of you are probably familiar with him now. That's very gratifying for me because that's what I wanted to finally happen for this man's story to really kind of get out there. But Thomas Kammerer was always believed to be a potter of white European descent. It was a chance encounter with a census record. And by the way, if you can hear sirens in the background, I'm sorry for that. We just had a really bad storm go through about a half hour ago, so I hope everybody is okay. But everything's fine here now. Thomas Kammerer, I stumbled upon this census record in early 2003, right around the turn of the year, that noted that Thomas Kammerer was actually a black man. And this completely changed my outlook on New York City stoneware and really what was possible with research in American stoneware all together. So this object, and so I eventually fleshed out Kamara's life. That culminated in the book that I published about 18 months ago or so, called Kamara Stoneware, The Life and Work of the First African-American Pottery Owner. I'm really grateful for how well this book was received, and I'm really grateful for, again, his story really getting out there. At the time we sold this jug, though, it was still generally understood that Thomas Kamara was a white potter of European descent, as I said before. And this was in July 2009 we offered this. This object was actually found in a barn in North Carolina. And I think it just speaks to the absolute beauty of this object, that it realized $28,750 well before any of that great history had been attached to it. It was acquired by the great stoneware benefactors, Bill and Susan Mariner, and eventually displayed, I think in 2015, it was first displayed possibly at the Milwaukee Art Museum. And I want to give them a shout out. This is the Chipstone Galleries at the Milwaukee Art Museum. This was the first museum that really took Kamara seriously and had a spot in a gallery for his work with an acknowledgement of his heritage and all those sorts of things. So obviously, as always, awesome job by the Chipstone Foundation. Since the sale of that object, we actually have sold a couple of really high-level Kamara objects I just wanted to share because I'm just so fond of them. The one on the left sold for $96,000 in fall 2021, and the one on the right, which graced the cover of my book, that sold for $120,000 in 2023 and was purchased by the DAR Museum. So it was really exciting to see such a high-level American institution acquire that object. I'm just going to sneak this picture in there, even though it's a little extraneous because I'm so fond of it. There's that jug that I just showed you that was on the left. Now it's on the right. In the middle is an extremely high-level example of New York City stoneware made by one of Kamara's contemporaries, now acquired by one of the great American stoneware collectors. And on the left, we have a David Drake jug. So I just love seeing the three of them together. That one on the left says, Alum says his handle will crack, and that brought, I believe, in excess of $400,000 in the year 2021. But I really want to drive something home, which is that one thing that primarily motivates us at Crocker Farm is the ability to put these stories, attach stories to these objects, to recognize forgotten potters or traditionally marginalized potters, and find lost works that we can then bring to the public. So I really, I don't talk about this a lot, but I love this object on the left there. That is a jar that is stamped Hugh Smith & Co. You can barely see the maker's mark at the top there. At the bottom, there's an incised D, and that's a D for David Jarber, who was an African-American potter working in Alexandria, Virginia. That object was on our website for sale the night we went live when we first launched a website in 2001 prior to our auctions. The Jarber attribution that we gave it really didn't add anything to the value at the time monetarily. The value was really in that really rare maker's mark, Hugh Smith & Co. But it was always really important to us that we give these people credit and we help further their story even though they're long gone. At times we sort of feel like we're speaking for people who can't speak for themselves. So on the right there, you have a list of about 50 completely forgotten or almost completely forgotten African-American potters that I was able to rediscover as part of the Kamara project that I worked on. I was just really happy to be able to bring these people's names to the modern world. These people are now starting to be researched, and that research was completely sponsored by Crocker Farm, as was the book, all that. So I'm just really proud of the work we do here in that regard. Speaking of potters that are forgotten or potters for whom we have no known work, all that sort of thing, these are two objects that really kind of stick out to me that I'm going to talk about very briefly. The one on the left says Whiskey Gauger, and at the bottom it says Jacob Bockley. Now this piece was made at Texarkana Pottery in Texarkana, Arkansas. The one on the right is a picture stamped Holmes, Georgetown, DC. That was made by a potter named Samuel Holmes, who worked in Georgetown. What's interesting is, or gratifying for me, is that these were two potters that I had researched before we had any confirmation that there was any surviving work from them. So for instance, Jacob Bockley, people had been feverishly trying to find the maker of these Texarkana pottery objects that were made really within the broader school of Anna pottery, which is very famous. They were not able to do so. Now, I believe that people were mainly looking for this potter in the Texas side of Texarkana, because Texarkana is split between Texas and Arkansas. I started digging around in Arkansas and I found this potter that had to be the man making the Texarkana pottery objects, but it wasn't until this object surfaced actually on the Antiques Roadshow and we were able to subsequently sell it, that we were able to prove that that Jacob Bockley was the man making the Texarkana pottery objects. That was really exciting. The Holmes piece, I had seen an ad for Samuel Holmes Stoneware Manufactory in Georgetown, and I had written an article many years ago in Washington, D.C. Stoneware. I wasn't even sure that Samuel Holmes owned a shop. I wasn't sure what his role was. And then this picture, I believe it was found in a basement, just came out of nowhere. And that just really blew my mind because I immediately thought, it just said Holmes, but I immediately knew that the potter's first name was Samuel because it had this ad ringing around in the back of my mind. So with this in mind, it just brings me to an object like this, which is a double chambered ring bottle. So you could actually put two different kinds of liquids in this object. You could have half water, half booze. You could have two different kinds of booze if you really wanted to have some fun. But this was the first object that surfaced that was signed by a potter who had been well documented, in this case by a great researcher named Amy Birch, who had done a lot of work on Loudoun County stoneware, really in the wake of some excavations that had happened there, some interesting objects that had surfaced. And we were excited to be able to bring the first signed example of George Duncan's work to market. So here's the other side of this object. And you can see it has these wonderful inscriptions. It has a federal eagle. It has this slogan, "Where liberty dwells, there is my country," which is directly from Benjamin Franklin. We have peace, plenty, and independence, which is a popular slogan of the time. And here you have the signature. This object was actually it was way out in the Midwest, and the people thought highly enough of it to keep it in a safety deposit box, even though I think prior to them even knowing exactly what it was, they had it in the safety deposit box. They actually eventually found out what it was, consigned it to us, and Luke actually flew out to get this object and flew it back, and it brought $204,000, which is the world auction record for Virginia stoneware. And that happened in the spring of 2023. This soldier's turn really sticks out to me. This was a case where a young guy was helping out a small historical association in New Jersey. And they had a building fund where they had mounting bills and they felt it was time to deaccession some work. I don't think they definitely did not fully understand the value of this object at all. I think they felt it was fairly valuable, but somewhere under $100,000. My brothers, Mark and Luke, actually picked this up, and it was kind of a funny story in that they were taking another object up to a major collector to show them from the auction with the prospect of bidding on it, and they picked this up along the way, and when the collector saw it, he absolutely had to have it. Ended up winning it for $402,500 at our July 2014 auction, and that completely changed, the trajectory of that organization. And when I think about that kind of thing, there have been many, many cases, really too many to name, where we've been able to properly market these objects, and it's really gratifying to see them make actual life changes for people, just based on our own efforts. This one really sticks out to me, just sort of as a parenthetical, because it was the first time I really saw that in action. There was a woman out in Missouri who had bought this for $3 at like a big yard sale. And she just Googled the name on the bottom, which is John W. Bell, Waynesboro, Pennsylvania. You can see that this is coated in a beautiful glaze. This is a glaze that turns up on a lot of utilitarian objects from John W. Bell. So we were like blown away that this whippet even existed. And she consigned it to us, and it brought $41,800 at our May 2005 auction. And she had like some serious medical bills that were looming over her, and this completely changed her life. And I just remember being so excited for her that this worked out like that. Speaking of whippets, though, I really want to focus on these two because these were just kind of an unheard of thing. They were completely unknown to the collecting community. They were made by the famous potter Samuel Bell in Winchester, Virginia. They both have 1841 dates on the bottom, and they're hand signed by Samuel Bell. One of them also has this small maker's stamp that you can barely see there, stamped into the edge of the base, S. Bell, which is an unusual variant of his mark. But these pieces, one thing that's notable is the green paint that you see. That's really fantastic. These really came out of nowhere. And the consignor, it's really interesting. You can see how these things migrate. He was in Florida, but he had descended from people who had owned the land in Winchester where the Apple Blossom Mall, that any of you in the Valley are well familiar with that mall, now stands. But anyway, these objects brought $115,000 at our July 2013 auction. Now it's two of them, but still by lot, that is still the world auction record for a lot of Shenandoah Valley pottery. In 2020, right before COVID broke out, we were emailed this fantastic water cooler. This was another case where the woman, she kind of knew she had something, and she was using the money to grow her business, which was a really cool thing that we were able to help her with that. But you can see this is the original email we received from her. It was a little dingy looking in the pictures. It had actually had some of the handles. Someone had put, who knows when this happened, but they had put some paint over the handles and things like that. So Luke was able to really clean it up when we got it back here. But he actually flew out to where the woman lived out west and drove it all the way back here. This piece, I could spend a really long time on this, and it's almost too much, the decoration on this object. We have here a scene, and it is a street scene. And so again, like kind of back to that memorial piece we were talking about, when you get an object like this, you start wondering what is going on here. So there are a lot of inscriptions that really help us with that. But, and I'm gonna get to that in a second, but long story short, this is commemorating a society called the Sons of Temperance, which was a temperance organization, a fraternal organization, and it is commemorating a specific event in New York City. So what we're seeing here is a Broadway street scene, and my brother Mark, I believe, named it the Broadway Cooler, and it's still known that to this day. But we have these inscriptions, like it says Sons of Temperance, Salina Division, which was a chapter of the Sons of Temperance near where this object was made, which is in Gettys, New York, basically modern day Syracuse. That 1846 date is important because that's when this big national jubilee happens for the Sons of Temperance in New York. We're going to talk about that in a second. It was made by W.H. Farrar and Co. But you see these wonderful touches, like this woman, she's ringing a bell. And underneath her, you see this slogan, love, purity, and fidelity. You see that at the top as well. And so we were actually able to find advertisements for what was going on here. We have Sons of Temperance. There's their slogan, love, purity, and fidelity. It says, great national jubilee of the Sons of Temperance to take place in this city. That's New York City. It says, this day, the day will be ushered in by the ringing of bells of the churches in this and the adjoining cities at sunrise. That's what the woman's doing. We have this flag off to the side that says Star of Temperance. We were actually able to find an illustration of just such a flag on one of their pamphlets. Again, there's that slogan, love, purity, and fidelity. Here's the Grand Lodge in New York City, and that was actually adjacent to a building that has this cupola on it. And we were thinking, what is that cupola? Well, we were able to find this image of the New York Hospital, which was adjacent to the Grand Lodge, and you can see that that's pretty darn close to the same cupola. So I'm pretty sure that's what that depicts. Again, this is just a wonderful Broadway street scene. It was eventually acquired for $480,000 in our spring 2020 auction by Adam Weitzman, who is one of the great American stoneware benefactors, obviously, and it's now part of the fantastic New York State Museum collection. Speaking of things that just sort of come out of the blue, we have this fantastic baseball player jar that really came out of nowhere. This was a guy in Ohio, I believe, who took just a whole bunch of Crocs to an auction, and he said, that one's kind of special. I'm gonna hold that back. And he said he literally kept it in the back of his truck, and it was rolling around for I don't know how long before he finally called us. He said when we sold it that this was the second time that a Croc had really bailed him out, because he had at one time, I think, was digging a post on his property, and he found a Croc full of valuable coins. But this object, when we saw it, we immediately thought that it was probably depicting a baseball player. We were essentially able to absolutely confirm that by things like this image. Sort of like with the Broadway cooler, it's always fun to be able to bring this iconography into the research field, and you can see how similar that man's head is to this image from 1877. And this object ended up bringing $65,550, and this was in July 2008. So that was a world auction record at the time for Pennsylvania stoneware. It is now the world auction record for Western Pennsylvania stoneware. To this day, it maintains that record. Now the record for Pennsylvania stoneware is this William Moyer Harrisburg cooler that we sold in spring 2022 for $144,000. One thing that's been gratifying, it's kind of like something I talked about at the beginning. We try to bring things that are a little more regional, that we think deserve a broader audience, to a broader audience. So this is an Edgefield District, South Carolina face jug. These obviously have been receiving a lot of attention for a number of years now. And we're a big part of that exhibition, Hear Me Now, that I'm going to talk about briefly later, that started at the Met. But this object was found for only $25, I believe, in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey. And the consignor had put it on eBay. This was in July 2015. And people were hammering his inbox to try to sell it to them outright. And that kind of sent his radar up. And then one person emailed him. A woman said, "You ought to contact Crocker Farm." And he did that. And we put it in that sale. And it brought $92,000, which was far and away the record for an American face jug at the time. It sold to a major New York City collector. And since then, we've seen face jugs perform really well at our sales. For instance, on the left there, we have the world auction record for an American face vessel. That's $177,000. That sold in July 2019. That's an Ohio face jug that was at one time on the Antiques Roadshow. A really fantastic object. And on the right, that jug sold in spring 2023 for $144,000 to the Baltimore Museum of Art. It was really exciting to see them acquire it. Just from a personal level, that was like my go-to field trip place when I was growing up. So it is really cool that they acquired that jug, and that is the world auction record for an Edgefield face vessel, I believe, for an American face jug period, because the one on the left is not technically a jug, it's a cooler. A big subset of stoneware collecting that we have really, I would say, brought to a more broader market is Anna Pottery. If you're not familiar with this, these are wild creations that come from Anna, Illinois, Southern Illinois, the Kirkpatrick brothers, who in my opinion were some of our great ceramic geniuses of all time. This pig bottle, which they were so famous for, sold in our first sale, our July 2004 auction. This still holds the record for a salt glazed and a pig bottle. We've since broken that for an Albany glazed one. But this brought $23,100, which kind of blew the minds of a lot of more regional collectors because they weren't used to seeing those numbers, but this sold to a really high-level collector. Subsequently, we sold this great Anna snake jug, which is the world auction record for an Anna snake jug, in November of 2018 for $141,600. But the piece I really want to talk about here as far as Anna Pottery is concerned is this, the Anna Pottery Liberty Monument. I'm not exaggerating when I say that this was really one of the great privileges of our career to bring this object to the modern world. It is hard for me to say that there is a more significant 19th century American ceramic object than this one. I would also go so far to say that this is the Kirkpatrick brothers' masterpiece. So, and I think it shows off their genius. And how they weren't just messing around there in Southern Illinois. They were really thoughtful people. But this was emailed to us. The consignor, this was out of Idaho. The consignor thought this was a piece of sewer tile. So you can see that in the first line there. I'm sending you a few photos, what I believe to be a quite rare piece of folk art sewer tile. It would be great if it was sewer tile, but it was really over the top as what it was, which was a piece of the from the Kirkpatrick brothers in Anna, Illinois. And there's many reasons why that's the case. To Anna collectors, this is at face value an Anna object, but for those of you who are wondering, like, there are certain figures that show up on here that are exact Anna figures that you see on other works. Their handwriting is exactly the same. Everything about this is 100% an Anna piece. But what this is depicting is one of the great tragedies in American history, which is something known as the Colfax Massacre. So the Colfax Massacre is actually considered to be perhaps the greatest lynching in American history. What happened was on Easter Sunday, 1873, a group of black militiamen in Colfax, Louisiana, were slaughtered by white supremacists in the wake of a dispute over an election. And so voting rights are involved in this, and you're going to see that in a second. But this actually depicts the massacre itself. So on the left, you see what's happening to these people at the hands of white supremacists. You see a woman on the right there trying to climb to the top of this tower. And what she's climbing toward is the figure on the top, which is Liberty. She's also possibly climbing toward a ballot box. But my brother Mark named this the Liberty Monument, and that's what it's known as today. But you see that the Kirkpatrick brothers were actually outraged by what happened. And the massacre itself is labeled Our Protection Under the Civil Rights Bill, which is a reference to the Civil Rights Act. It's talking about the irony of what happened to these people despite the passage of the Civil Rights Act. And then on the right there, we have the great show cost $3 trillion, which is a reference to the Civil War, asking, in a sense, was it worth it if this is what's happening to African Americans? Again, we were able to attach some of this period imagery and research to this object. But where it sort of takes this object over the top is that the Kirkpatrick brothers saw a pun that was just waiting to be exploited in this object, in that around the same time, President Grant's Vice President Schuyler Colfax, same name as Colfax, Louisiana, was embroiled in a scandal. And so this object is sort of playing with the tragedy of seeing what's happening to people, those people down in Colfax, Louisiana, and then what's happening to the most affluent of society, who are able to skate past and engage in graft and all those sorts of things. This object we were really gratified to see it acquired by one of our favorite great American institutions, Winterthur in Delaware. It is one of the centerpieces of their galleries there now. It was acquired for $600,000 in the summer of 2021. which would have been a world auction record for American stoneware if one lot before the David Drake verse jar had not sold, but I'm going to talk about that in a minute. This is still the world auction record for an example of Albany glazed American stoneware. The world auction record for salt glazed American stoneware is this fantastic cooler made by the same person who made the H. Myers cooler that I started this talk with. You can see the extreme detail on this eagle. I think this object really does just speak for itself. We were so excited to be able to sell this. This came out of a very strong Pennsylvania collection, and we offered it in October of 2015. It brought $483,000. That was obviously, that's not just the world auction record for salt glazed stoneware, it's obviously the world auction record for Baltimore stoneware. And in the interim, I just want to show this because this was a really amazing piece to get to handle. This had broken the record in the interim between the H. Myers cooler and that cooler. This cooler surfaced, and this was kind of a wild story in that it came to us completely out of the blue, emailed out of the blue from someone representing an elderly man in South Florida. That man, who was in his 90s, and I think he had it sitting on his kitchen floor at the time. His grandfather had been a milkman in Annapolis, Maryland in the 1880s, and the famous Maryland Inn there was deciding to redecorate. And they said, this is not in keeping with our current decor, we are throwing this out. So the milkman got a hold of it, and it descended in that family. It is signed under one of your Morgan maker in Baltimore for William Morgan, who was a well-known stoneware maker. But the decoration on this thing is just way over the top. It's an example of the kind of thing that Baltimore was never known for until, I would say, rather recently. And it sold for $230,000 in July 2013. But I'm going to end this talk with this object. The Liberty Monument's another example, along with this one, where in some cases we consider it an extreme privilege to bring these objects to market and bring them to the American public in the modern world and interpret them. This is a massive 25-gallon jar and is made by a man who is now considered, in my opinion, I think incontrovertibly, the most famous historic American stoneware potter. His name obviously is David Drake. And I like to say that Dave's story is one of the great, probably the greatest example of American ceramic triumph, because you have a person who lived through enslavement for almost their entire life. He was only freed by the Emancipation Proclamation and the Civil War, but he was able to transcend his enslavement by making objects that still speak to us today. And so Dave's legacy lives on and only grows all the time. This object is a massive jar, very heavy, and it has 4 handles, as you can see here. You can see this beautiful glaze, and this is one of the rare examples that bears one of Dave's couplets, which was technically illegal for him to write on these objects. So that's something that augments their importance. But you can see here it says, a very large jar which has 4 handles, pack it full of fresh meats, then light candles, which is a reference to how you would use a jar like this, and how you would pack meat in it. That's what it was used for. But here it is signed by Dave with an April 12th, 1858 date. And here is a picture of it, acquired by the consignor in 1971 as a potted plant. We were incredibly gratified to see this object really get its due with the American art world. We're excited to see the amount of interest that it received from major American art galleries, etc. And it realized $1.56 million, which is the world auction record for American pottery at all. Like, there is no other object that has ever sold for more than that in the history of American ceramics at auction. And I think that further just vindicates David Drake and solidifies his legacy. It's sold to Crystal Bridges down in Arkansas, the museum that was founded by Alice Walton. And so they have an amazing display for this jar there, but it also became the centerpiece of Hear Me Now, which was the fantastic, really groundbreaking exhibition that started at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in September 2022, moved to the MFA Boston, Michigan Museum of Art, and eventually the High Museum in Atlanta. And I'm sorry, it was the University of Michigan Museum of Art. I didn't want to get that wrong. But it is, as I said, something we've always striven to see, which is these objects amplified to the level of American art like we believe they should be. I feel like a great image to end with is the one of this object used as a potted plant, because I think it's important to remember that as people who get to interact with these objects today, these objects don't actually have intrinsic value. They aren't monetary value, I should say. They aren't precious metals. But just getting back to the kind of things I talked about to start this talk, I really feel like some of the things that we set out to do with Crocker Farm, play into our modern understanding of these objects. So it's things like a confident understanding of what this object is. It's being able to exhaust the historical record and just interpret this object. What does this object mean? Why is it being made? Who made it, et cetera, and to accurately attribute things. It's an understanding that an object, for instance, made by, say, an enslaved craftsman or someone else operating outside the bounds of formal art training, is still art through and through. And that's really what has always driven us. And again, I just thank all of you for paying attention to American Stoneware and having the same love for it that we do. I'm going to conclude this talk, but I just want to say that we are in the midst, or have just started. This auction has started on the 20th anniversary of our first auction. We are just starting our 20th anniversary sale, which will end on July 26th. That auction is happening on our website, www.crockerfarm.com. And I really want to brag on my brother here who decorated this object, which is a fabulous American Stoneware object. We were absolutely thrilled when we saw this come out of the kiln. It was thrown by the illustrious Jerry Beaumont, that so many of you know, a renowned American Stoneware potter. And Mark decorated this with lots of different designs taken from things we've sold over the years. We're going to give this away. This is an amazing thing. We're going to give it away to one of our winning bidders. So if you win something in the summer auction, you have an equal chance with every other winning bidder to acquire this object, and we will ship it to you free of charge, and you can enjoy it. Just as we always say, if we can ever do anything for you, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. I hope you got something out of this talk. Mark, were there any interesting questions or anything that popped up on the chat? No? Okay, great. Well, listen, I really thank you all for tuning in tonight, and have a great evening. Thank you.